Introducing Punchbowl News. From Anna Palmer, Jake Sherman, and John Bresnahan. News about the people who matter, for the people who matter. Join the community at punchbowl.news.
Well, good Tuesday morning. I'm Anna Palmer, co-founder of Punchbowl News. I'm joined by my fellow co-founder, Jake Sherman, for a virtual pop-up conversation focused on infrastructure with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. A big thank you to AEM for partnering with us to make this conversation possible.
Our mission with these events is simple. It's to bring you closer to the decision makers in Washington. Secretary Buttigieg is playing a key role in the Biden administration as it looks to sell a massive infrastructure plan to lawmakers and the American people.
A quick reminder to please tweet about the conversation on social media using the hashtag PunchbowlNews. And before Secretary Buttigieg joins us for the conversation, I want to invite Austin Ramirez, CEO of Husco and Vice Chair of AEM's Infrastructure Vision 2050 Task Force, for a fireside chat.
Morning, Jake and Anna. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. So for those who are watching virtually and aren't familiar with Husco, give us the 30-second cliff notes of what your company does.
Sure. We're an engineering and manufacturing company based in Waukesha, Wisconsin, just outside Milwaukee. We make hydraulic and electromechanical components for all sorts of mobile equipment. So think companies like John Deere and Caterpillar, and also passenger car manufacturers like Ford and GM.
Based in the Midwest, and Waukesha, as we were talking about beforehand, is a hotbed of campaign visits for a lot of campaign reporters. A lot of frustration out there in the country that Republicans and Democrats can't work together. A lot of frustration here in the Capitol where I'm sitting as well. Would your preference be for a smaller bill that would have bipartisan support?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no reason for infrastructure not to be bipartisan. There's plenty of policy issues that I think Democrats can argue can only get done, if they jam it through on a single party basis. But infrastructure is something that both parties agree on, that the majority of American people agree on. And I think there's no reason for this not to be bipartisan. I think it will be a better bill, a more sustainable bill if it's done on a bipartisan basis.
So talk about that, because right now, obviously, the Biden administration has proposed a massive hard infrastructure as well as kind of some non-traditional infrastructure as part of a larger package. But what to you are the must-haves, non-negotiables, if they were to be able to move forward with this bipartisan package that both sides are working on right now?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere between the posturing on both sides, right? Infrastructure is certainly more than roads and bridges, but infrastructure is not everything. So, I think a reasonable infrastructure bill would include roads and bridges. It would include energy infrastructure and broadband and ports and waterways and drinking water and rail systems and all the sorts of things that we normally think about when we think about our nation's infrastructure.
Another big sticking point is how to pay for the overall package. A lot of businesses have been opposed to raising the corporate rate. Is that something you could support, and tell us a little bit about what impact that might have for you guys?
Yeah, I say the first thing I'd say is that it should be paid for, right? This isn't an emergency stimulus bill. I don't think it should be deficit funded. I also don't think putting it all on the back of a corporate tax increase is the right strategy. Raising corporate taxes has all kinds of negative implications that will be a drag on growth long term. And I think infrastructure should be funded with dedicated revenue streams, different types of user fees. Personally, I'd love to see a VMT. I think now is a good time for a carbon tax that could fund part of an infrastructure bill. And maybe some portion of it funded by a corporate tax increase. But the more dedicated funding we can create, the more sustainable these infrastructure programs are going to be longer term.
So as Jay kind of mentioned at the top, a lot of politicians head to Wisconsin, head to your neck of the woods in Milwaukee. The Vice President Kamala Harris, I believe, is there today talking about infrastructure. Yep. What advice? I mean, you're on the ground. We're here in Washington, and oftentimes I think there's two different kind of conversations happening inside the Capitol, and then kind of just in terms of folks trying to get through their day and pay for their bills. But how do you think people like Kamala Harris should be talking about infrastructure to get that widespread support that's going to be needed?
Here's the good news. Infrastructure investment is the best way to stimulate the economy, to put Americans to work, to support American equipment manufacturers and American manufacturing in general. And I think most Americans realize that. So I think the best way to sell this bill is just to be reasonable, to be pragmatic, to work on a bipartisan basis, to get a reasonably conceived bill through Congress and signed by the president.
Austin, thanks so much for joining us. I think we are ready for Secretary Buttigieg. And Ann, are we ready for Secretary Buttigieg right now?
I think we are ready here in a second for him to join us. But Austin, we really do appreciate you coming and talking to us this morning about AAM's priorities and what that is going to look like. I think in the meantime, Jake, why don't we talk a little bit about what we wrote about this morning about kind of the Republicans and Democrats, the kind of the 5 reasons to think that Democrats should go in this bipartisan manner. I think that's one of the things that we've been talking a lot about. How do Democrats and Republicans find some ways to move together here?
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity to frame up the conversation, Anna, which is that this is the administration and Democrats on Capitol Hill are moving in a rapid manner here to get an infrastructure bill passed. They want to get it through the House by the July 4th recess. That's their original goal. And by the way, Anna, this is not like, and Austin alluded to this, it's not like an emergency package in many ways. For number one, because a lot of the policies in the American Rescue Package that Congress put into place were already conceived of, right? These were already policies that Congress had worked on in the past, had worked on before, and had crafted in the previous administration. What they're doing with transportation and what they're doing with infrastructure is completely different. Why is it different? Because we haven't had a large-scale public works package for a very long time. So a lot of these policies are being developed from scratch. There's a whole new world out there, right? There's the gas tax is not as operable for funding infrastructure as it once was. Electric vehicles don't pay the gas tax. There are more electric vehicles now than there were ever, obviously. There's more and more every year. So Congress really has to wrap its head around a new reality when it comes to how people are moving and how people are engaging with the environment. And Democrats say they want an infrastructure package to include all sorts of green technologies, a marked difference from, of course, the last administration, which did not put those policies in place.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is we're about to have Secretary Pete Buttigieg join us here, but I think one of the things to also think about this is this selling that this administration is doing, right? You have the vice president in Wisconsin today, as we mentioned before, but you also have Joe Biden making a real sales pitch in a way that they did on COVID, but there was so much, agreement, right? In terms of everybody just wanted to have the country come back, to have the vaccine be successful, to have, needles in shots in arms. But infrastructure is a little bit different. As much as there is widespread agreement, and there's been long-term, I think, agreement, Republicans and Democrats, about the fact that they do need to do something with this crumbling infrastructure, that they do need to have a real focus on long-term, spending as it comes to a highway bill or comes to roads and bridges. Every single district, every single state has those issues, right? This crumbling infrastructure that all too often we see really catastrophic things happen. I'm thinking of, in Minnesota and other places. And the real question is, how did they kind of galvanize that momentum to all of a sudden be able to say, all right, now is the time to actually get not only the American people, but also Republicans and Democrats on the same page. And with that, I think we are going to hopefully welcome to the stage here Secretary Pete Buttigieg, the Transportation Secretary, to talk a little bit about what he is doing, his role with the administration, with the effort to try and get this massive infrastructure package, which is sweeping, almost FDR-like legislation that has been proposed, to welcome him to the stage here. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right,
so Secretary, appreciate you being with us. So we at Punchbowl News have been covering the infrastructure process probably like it's our Super Bowl. So I want to get to that in a second. I want to frame up the conversation a little bit about your new role. Went from running a city of 102,000 to running a department with a budget of $86 billion. Quite a leap. You're the tip of the spear for what is really one of the largest legislative efforts we've ever covered in the more than 10 years Anna and I've been covering Congress together. I mean, give us a sense of how you've gotten into this. What's the biggest thing that surprised you about the department?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a surprise, but it's definitely been remarkable to see just the quality of people who are here. 55,000 employees, all of whom are here because I think they really care about the things we work on in the department. And another thing that I think would surprise most Americans is the range of things we do. Stuff everybody knows about, like the FAA and the Federal Highway Administration. And then things like hazardous materials and pipeline safety that aren't as often in the headlines, but very much part of what we do. It's a phenomenal team, and yes, it's a shift from the work I was doing as mayor, although of course I'm thinking every day about that perspective of having been a mayor, sometimes having been a mayor, trying to get my calls returned in Washington in agencies like those that are here in the Department of Transportation, and making sure we're responsive to communities of all sizes.
Well, give us your back of the envelope analysis of where you think the administration stands in convincing Congress to act on President Biden's infrastructure bill. How close are we?
So the state of play is, first of all, driven by the fact that there is enormous public impatience to do something here. So the best thing we have going for us, I think, is the fact that we don't have a lot of work to do to convince the American people that this is a good plan. We'll continue to work to remind the American people about what's in it, why we think it'll make a big difference, and importantly, why this isn't just about getting through this quarter or this year economically, but really creating the kind of economic strength that we're going to need generationally for this country to be thriving into the future. Now, as we've learned, especially this year, even something that is wildly popular among Democrats and Republicans in every part of the country can't necessarily count on the same level of support on Capitol Hill. And that's why we're closely engaging, by the way, not just sharing, but listening as we speak to members of both chambers and both parties. You've seen the president convening in the Oval Office, members of both parties in the House and Senate. I can tell you I'm on the phone just about every day with members of the House and Senate in both parties and with stakeholder groups, business, labor, people involved in obviously transportation that I work on and a lot of other areas to continue moving this conversation forward. I think these next few days and weeks are really going to be critical in terms of forming and passing something that's going to, again, not just be the transportation policy of the moment, but really a defining decision for generation to come.
So I want to ask you to put your prognosticator hat on for a second here. A lot of Democrats make the argument that you have all the levers of power right now, and waiting for Republicans to be convinced that this is good for them is a waste of time. And I'm curious how you just think of that dynamic, that you do have very narrow majorities, obviously, in both chambers. Why is it important for you to get Republicans along instead of just pushing it through on your own?
Well, the president believes that the best way to move things along is on a bipartisan basis. It may not always be possible, but it has a lot of value in terms of the durability and the strength of the policies that we're trying to pursue. And by the way, that's important to a lot of members of the Democratic caucus, not all, but many on Capitol Hill as well. And I guess the other thing I would say is, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you try to make sure you can get as much support as you can from both sides? Now, I will say the president's also made very clear that inaction is not an option. This is not a process that should be dragging on. This is one that needs to be efficient, needs to be swift, but needs to be thorough. And those kinds of conversations we're having, inviting Republicans to bring specific ideas to the table, seeing where there might be overlap, seeing where there might be agreement, especially in an area like infrastructure, where there is so much common ground. It was a mayor who famously said there's no such thing as a Democratic or a Republican hole in the road. And that's one of the reasons I think you see in so-called red and blue states alike a lot of eagerness to make something happen here. If there's any area of domestic policy left where we can do something on a bipartisan basis, I've got to believe it's on things like transportation infrastructure.
Is there a time, though, where you say, all right, we have done everything we can do. We have gone down the road to try to find a pathway forward, and it just isn't happening? Is there a deadline, a kind of a line in the sand, and you say, all right, we need to move now because the cost is too great to wait and have nothing happen?
Yeah, I think that's what the president is expressing when he says that inaction is not an option. And I don't know that it's been laid down in the form of a date, but as you know, there's a lot of impatience on the part of the public and a lot of eagerness on the part of this administration. And by the way, the people we're talking to in Congress to get something done and to make sure it's real. And by the way, there are some timelines and clocks that are moving in some ways with or without us. If you think about the things that just need to happen with, for example, a surface transportation bill that's up for renewal anyway this year, that's got to move this summer if it's going to be reauthorized. And so the committees are doing their work as we speak. And I think May in particular is a month where you're going to see a lot of action. The president's often said that we need to have major progress, major action by Memorial Day. And that with May having suddenly become the month we're in is calling for us to be very productive in the next days and weeks.
So it seems like something's got to budge this month. It sounds like you're saying.
We expect to see real movement in these days and weeks that are ahead for sure.
Let me ask you this, corporate tax rate. It seems to me that you guys not only believe that it's a pay for, but you also see raising the corporate tax rate in some way, shape, or form as a moral priority, as good policy, not only something to pay for this large scale bill. Is that a correct read of the situation from your end?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a good policy. Look, you don't change tax rates for its own sake. You do it in order to fund important priorities. But we've got the important priorities there in terms of infrastructure, and we've got the proposal on how to pay for it in terms of corporate tax rates. And by the way, one of the most interesting things about public support for this bill is it actually goes up from its already high levels when you explain to people how we're proposing to pay for it. Because people get it. They see that some of the biggest corporations in the world have been paying zero in taxes on billions in profits, and they know that doesn't make any sense. They've seen that just how much money was given away and turned into deficits by past policies that slash taxes on the wealthy, slash taxes on corporations. And by the way, those policies failed to deliver what they promised in terms of economic results. So what we're proposing here is not about punishing anybody. These rates aren't even high by historic standards. We're not calling for high taxes. We're just calling for normal tax rates by American historical standards on corporations and the wealthy. And I think this is also very important because some people are saying, well, can we afford this? And the truth is, as a matter of arithmetic, we can very easily afford this simply by resetting our tax rates to levels that are still lower than they've been for most of the post-war era in the United States.
Can you envision a bill without it?
Yes.
Sorry?
Could you envision a bill without raising the corporate rate? Sorry, Anna and I sometimes trip on each other's words because
we share a brain.
But could you envision a bill that does not in some way hike the corporate tax rate?
Well, the president said if other people have ideas on how to pay for this, they should bring them forward, and we'll hear them. Now, he does have a red line about raising taxes on people making less than $400,000 a year, but there are a lot of different ways to get there. And I should also mention, the corporate rate we believe it's the right thing to do, and it's an area that's getting a lot of attention. But there are a lot of provisions in what we're trying to do to fix the corporate tax code to reduce the incentive to park profits or move jobs overseas, for example, increased enforcement capabilities in the IRS, because even under the existing rates, we'd be collecting a lot more if we made sure everybody was paying their fair share. There are a whole bunch of different policy elements. The rate is just part of it, an important part, but far from the only part of what we're trying to do here.
Let's kind of shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the other pay-fors. Senator Mitt Romney has called for usage fees. Is that too small a ball for this administration? I mean, is there enough fees here to actually pay for what you're talking about, or is that just going to be a smaller portion of it?
If you did that exercise, you would find that it would take an incredibly large movement in that direction to get anywhere close to what we need to do. But maybe more importantly is the other side of the argument, which is we don't have to, right? We don't have to go there. The president has said he doesn't want to raise taxes on people making less than $400,000 a year, and we don't even have to look at it to find an easily paid for way to get this done. So I don't think that's the direction that you're going to see things evolve in here. It's definitely not where the president's thinking. We need to be ready to raise the revenue that it's going to take to actually do this. And again, it's there. It's absolutely there in a way that's compatible with growth, right? Most of our lifetimes, the corporate rate, for example, was in the 30s. And we had a lot of good growth in the 1990s at 35%. We had a lot of good growth in the post-war area when it was even higher than that. And all we're asking for is 28. That used to be the level that Republicans were saying it ought to be cut to. And now we're just trying to reset it to that. But again, there could be other ways to get there, and that's what we're inviting Republicans to discuss and bring to the table.
Okay, so speaking about Republicans, Mitch McConnell yesterday suggested in Louisville in an event in Kentucky that $600 billion, so the framework that Shelley Moore Capito and several other Republican senators have put out, is basically where he is, and he doesn't believe that Republicans should be above that, and that any bipartisan deal could be above $600 billion. Is there any way, period, for you guys to support what he's calling hard infrastructure bill that is at $600 billion?
Well, let me note a couple of things. So one, they brought forward their proposal, and we think that's the start for the conversations and the negotiations that are going on right now. I also want to say, when we say 600 billion, my next question would be compared to what, right? So the president's plan is, in addition to, this is a once in a lifetime investment, in addition to what would happen anyway. Not to get too wonky, but as you get into the baseline, right?
Yep.
So if Leader McConnell is saying we would do 600, is he saying 600 on top of the baseline, or is that counting what would have happened anyway, assuming that we reauthorize the surface bill? These are the kinds of more detailed, in the weeds issues that we're going through right now in the back and forth that's happening with the other side of the aisle. Obviously, we believe these things go together, and all the things that are in the American Jobs Plan, and for that matter, the American Families Plan, that they all fit together in a shared vision. But we're open to different conversations about the mechanisms and the processes and the legislative path to get it done.
So let me just clarify. He's comparing 600 billion to the 930, I think, 6 billion that you guys have in roads and bridges and hard transportation in your bill. That's the general apples to apples comparison that he seems to be making. So I'm curious. I mean, that's a cut of $300 billion. Is that? I mean, how do you react to that when knowing that that's how he's comparing it?
So yeah, again, I'm not certain even that would be apples to apples, but if he's calling for 600 over and above the baseline, then he's actually calling for more spending than we've seen proposed so far. So these are the kinds of things we're really trying to clarify and get into the weeds with. But look, what I will say is that we need to do something real. We need to do something big, and we need to do something that we'll remember looking back on the early 2020s, a generation or two from now. Because the need is there. Look, by our department's own estimations, we think there's about $1 trillion just looking at the backlog on dealing what we've already got. And we know, I mean, this is the whole idea of building back better, right? We know that just building back to what we had or fixing what we've got isn't going to be enough. We've got to build back better. That means fixing it. It means fixing it right. And sometimes it means fixing it differently than it was. You look at the equity implications of highways that divided and segregated neighborhoods. Should we really be keeping that highway the same way for the next 50 years, or should it be somewhere else? We're looking at massive transformations in terms of the way people potentially get around when you look at electric vehicles, to say nothing of automated vehicles coming in our future. You look at the possibilities around things like transit. You look at what it would mean to just give Americans the same quality of passenger rail infrastructure that citizens in other countries, from China and Japan to Turkey or Spain, can count on as a matter of course. That's not going to happen by tinkering around the edges. We've got to be ready to do something that is a significant generational investment that would be the kind of thing that we could look back on the way today we look back on what the interstate highway system under Eisenhower did for the economy and the life of this country.
I want to talk a little bit about manufacturing. There's been a lot of talk about how this package would spend $300 billion to promote advanced manufacturing to restock the country's strategic national stockpile of pharmaceuticals, including vaccines. Biden has talked a lot about how this plan would increase jobs. I think his speech, State of the Congress, mentioned jobs dozens and dozens of times. Do you expect to see a significant spike in manufacturing jobs across the country? Can you talk about what this kind of a package and passage of it would mean for that industry in general?
Yeah, this hits really close to home for me because I grew up in an auto town. Actually, it was a former auto town that had a major automaker that went bust in the 1960s, and we were still feeling it when I was growing up. But also a thriving auto supply chain that was doing a lot of good work in smaller businesses. The truth is that we could be doing more, and we will be doing more under the president's plan to make sure we support manufacturing right here in the U.S. You think about electric vehicles, for example. Electric vehicles are an area that is clearly the future of where so much of the automotive industry is going. The real question isn't whether there are going to be more EVs in the future. There will. The question is whether the EVs of the future are going to be built in America, on American soil by American workers and American companies, union workers, we'd hope, or are they going to be made in other countries and brought here? These are the kinds of things that that question isn't going to just reach a good conclusion without us having some intention. That means investing in our workforce. It means investing in a manufacturing sector here. It means looking at supply chains. The reliance that we have on semiconductors, for example, that's the one we're seeing at the moment, produced overseas, is really a limiting factor on U.S. Manufacturing. But today it's semiconductors, tomorrow it could be batteries or something else if we don't strengthen our domestic capabilities. The other thing I would point out is that this is a great example of why the time has come to break the old false choice of climate versus jobs. Because investing to get ahead of the climate challenge that is such an imperative for the world and for the country is also one that can mean creating millions of good paying jobs right here in the US. So that's why, yes, the theme of this plan is infrastructure, but the point of this plan is jobs.
And let's talk about EVs for a second. We're running out of time quickly, but I mean, you've gone through a bunch of, you meaning the administration and Congress have gone through a bunch of different proposals to make sure EVs pay their fair share, right? Because they don't consume fuel, they don't consume gas. I mean, what is your latest thinking? And your answer cannot be when we want to see what Congress comes up with. I want to know what you guys think about EVs and how EVs will help rebuild roads and things of that nature.
Look, I mean, we've increasingly seen over the last few years a move toward using more general funds in order to fund our roadways, which is just separate from the way that fees and charges are assessed at the vehicle level. That's true federally. I don't know whether that will continue or not, but that's been the pattern in the last few years. Locally and in different states, very different stories, and each state is approaching this, I think, in a somewhat distinct way. Some counties impose a wheel tax. They don't really care what's powering the engine. They just go by the car. But it's different at the federal level. And I know you didn't want this answer, but this is the conversation we're having with Congress about the long run. The important thing I want to mention, though, or I should say the important thing I want to repeat until I'm blue in the face, is that the American Jobs Plan is fully funded without looking in that direction, because we can do it just by having normal corporate tax rates in this country and making other needed reforms.
Could I just ask one more question? Do you have a sense of what if you could encapsulate it, what does Joe Manchin care about?
Well, you need to ask him about that. But I'll tell you, I'm talking to him and everyone else in the Senate and the House about this. And I think, the most important thing, whether it's one senator or any other senator or House member, is they're all from somewhere. They all came here to look after people who voted for them and sent them here to Washington. And they're thinking about what this means back home, from the roads and bridges to the stuff we're seeking to do in the care economy, to the manufacturing and R&D elements. There hasn't yet been an exception to this rule that every time I talk to a member of Congress or the Senate, I'm hearing about where they're from and how this will affect their voters, their businesses, their citizens. And that's where I'm trying to keep the focus too. And if we're doing a good job, then we're going to leave no question and no doubt about how people, whether they're in West Virginia or Indiana, where I come from, or right here in DC or anywhere else in this country, will be better off with this jobs plan than if we continue to tinker around the edges.
We are just going to ask you one last question and then we'll let you go here. But I do want to ask on the highway bill. We talked about it a little bit on the margins here. It's going to be coming up at the end of the fiscal year. Can you get this larger package done by them, or do you think you're going to have to extend the highway bill to give the broader kind of infrastructure package more time to get done?
Well, I mean, these are the mechanics that are playing out on Capitol Hill right now. But what I'll say is there's a lot of good policy work that has been under development for quite a while. You look at what the House did with H.R. 2. You look at the Senate, which unanimously, on a committee that had everybody from Bernie Sanders to John Barrasso, unanimously reported out their bill, their version last year. I mean, a lot of interesting work has been happening in the House and Senate on the policy side, as well as the funding side. And as a department, we would certainly benefit from having those reauthorizations move in addition to this job plan. How they're attached to each other or how they relate to each other, obviously there are a million different ways that could shake out. But we're continuing to be engaged on both of those tracks because there's such exciting potential on both of them.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are all out of time. Secretary Buttigieg, we really appreciate you joining us this morning for our pop-up conversation. And a big thank you to our sponsor, AEM, for making this conversation possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us on the live stream. We will be back with more virtual conversations and events, and hopefully events in person soon. You can check back at punchbowl.news for the latest on that. Thanks so much. Stay safe and have a great day.